My name is Hugh Martin, and I'm the organic consultant and inspector. And over the last 10 years, I have visited probably between a third and a half of the organic farms in Ontario, and have been heavily involved in the organic farm movement since the mid 1980s. When we talk about soil, we talk about half of the soil being mineral particles, so sand, silt, clay, and the other half being a pore space. Half of those pores are full of air, and half of them are typically full of water on an ideal type of soil. And then we've got somewhere between 1% and 5% of that soil complex that is organic matter, part of which is humus, but a lot of it is microorganisms and roots and other debris that becomes part of that soil complex. When we measure the various aspects of soil, we've got the physical, the chemical, and the biological. The chemical is usually tested for nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, magnesium, etc., as well as pH. And we also can test for the soluble salts, which can be a negative if they get too high, and for nutrient holding capacity, such as exchange capacity. The physical aspects, we talk about aggregation and structure. And basically, when we're looking at soil aggregation, those are the little clumps of soil. The soil particles themselves, sand, silt, clay, are very tiny, but they get glued together into little aggregates that are probably less than a 1/4 inch in size. And as those pack together in the soil, then that allows the air and water to pass through. And if they get too small, then we can have surface sealing. And the young seedlings have trouble coming up through the crust. And we can also get into compaction. We've talked about porosity. Compaction is basically where we get heavy tires or weight on the soil that packs down the pore space. So we don't have as much pore space as ideally we would like to see. And then, of course, we got water movement that goes up and down, and we can measure all those things. But the one thing we've talked a lot about in the last number of years is the biological aspects. The small insects, bacteria, and plant materials that are growing in the soil, the fungi, the microorganisms of all types. And then, of course, you got the roots and the biological activity. All of that is part of the organic matter that is in the soil. And all of that works together. All three of these circles work together, and organic matter is a key part of them all, because the more organic matter you got, the more nutrient holding capacity you got, the less compaction, the more porosity you've got, and the better soil aggregation. It all works together. But farmers can have problems with soil crusting, cloddy soil, which is basically where if it's worked too wet, you can have big chunks that are hard to break down. Water stress, too wet or too dry. And of course, prairies this year have been way too dry because of lack of rain. But where you've got just a dry spell of a few weeks, you need that organic matter to help hold more moisture in the soil. Also, if it's too much rain, as we've had in parts of Ontario this year, you want that water to be able to penetrate and go down through the soil so that it doesn't tend to waterlog the roots and block air from getting to the roots. We can also get into soil erosion, soil compaction, just from working too wet or driving on the fields. And all of these contribute to low yields. So we need to improve the soil health of our soils. These are some slides that I've taken a number of years ago. The first one in the top corner is the erosion taking place. This is a fairly steep hill that was worked up and down with the cultivator. Then they got a heavy rain, washed a bunch of that soil down into the bottom lower parts of the field. Some of that actually washed off into the roadside ditch. And you can see this particular ditch, which is at a different location, but it's got soil sediment that's accumulated and more than half blocked that culvert that goes under the road. And then, of course, the bottom of the slide, there is wind erosion on some sandy soils that's taking place. And these are all bad because we're losing the good parts of the soil, the organic matter, and the nutrients that are near the soil surface is what we tend to lose with both water and wind erosion. So now we talk about regenerative agriculture, and this is a new term that's come out in the last few years. But the principles of regenerative agriculture are to reduce, hopefully eliminate tillage, but it's really hard to eliminate tillage because we have to put the seed in the soil, and just by putting the seed in the soil, even really if you poke it in with your finger, you're causing a wee bit of tillage. Out in the fields, we plant most crops in rows, be they in narrow 7-inch rows or in wider rows that are 30, 40 inches wide. And every one of those rows, we're going to be doing some tillage to try to put the seeds in the ground. But we want to add diversity to the field. We don't want the same crop year after year in that field. We want cover crops and crop rotation. We'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. We want to try to keep the soil covered with both living and dead residue and maintain living roots, because it's the roots, and especially if you got cover crops in there so we can have those year round, it's the roots that secrete the little sugars on the tip of the roots. That helps to feed the soil microorganisms, and the microorganisms, they tend to break down more organic matter in the soil and make more nutrients available for the next crop that's growing. And it's also good if we can integrate livestock, because the hay crops are very good for soil health, pasture as well, and then of course we have manure that we can apply to the soil. And these things can all help on the soil health. And our basic goals of regenerative agriculture is to maintain and build soil carbon and soil biology, and of course to get better plant health and yields. This is a schematic that I found of the soil food web, where we've got a plant growing. It looks like a tree here with a bunch of leaves. We've got photosynthesis that's growing the leaves. Then in the fall of the year, the leaves, the crop residue, fall down to the soil surface. And then the various, I call them critters, but the various insects, animals, nematodes, bacteria, fungi, all work to break down that residue to release the nutrients for the next crop. And it's a big cycle. Actually, it's a whole lot of cycles that are all connected together. We talk about crop rotation, where you don't plant the same crop year after year. And this very quick diagram, I've got field crops, I've got corn. We follow that next year by soybeans. And then actually this time of year, the soybeans are being harvested. So we're going to plant winter cereals such as rye or wheat, or in this case, spelt. And then you might underseed that and plant legumes and grasses that can be used as pasture. And then after a couple of years, that can be plowed up and go back into corn. And the nutrients from the pasture help to feed the corn. Or if you're into horticulture crops, you can have lettuce. You can follow that with the winter cereals, and the winter cereals help to break the disease cycles and reduce weeds. That might be followed by a crop like yellow blossom sweet clover. And because of the high nitrogen that you can get from that, that helps to feed the broccoli crop that these people are happily harvesting. And the following year, you might plant that into lettuce again, and the cycle continues. But we rotate crops to try to get healthy soils, to reduce the crop pests of insects, diseases, and weeds. And it's very effective at reducing all of those things when you've got a well-managed crop rotation. That helps produce healthy crops, to increase yields, to improve quality of both the product and the soil. And the Canadian Organic Standards actually require that we have crop rotation and some other measures to help soil health. And these are direct quotes from the standards, that we're going to be establishing and maintaining a fertile soil humus, supply of nutrients, biological activity. Crop rotations, including plow down crops, or I'm calling them cover crops, legumes, catch crops, and deep rooted plants. And tillage practices shall maintain physical, chemical, and biological condition of the soil and minimize damage to tilth and structure and soil erosion, and to maintain and improve soil organic matter and fertility. So these are all things that are listed in the standards, and we certainly require farmers to practice a lot of these things as it applies in their field situation. We grow a lot of crops in Ontario. We have a lot of fresh market horticultural crops. There's approximately 200 fresh market crops that we're growing. And then some processing crops, that's not all of them, but sweet corn, green peas, green beans, edamame, tomatoes, grapes. Then we got a bunch of field crops. We got our hay and pasture crops. And then at the bottom, I've listed some of the cover crops. One of my favorite of which is the last one, sunflowers, which always look nice in the late summer out in that field growing, but they're actually a very effective cover crop as well. Now, this is some research that was done. I think this was done in the States, but there's been a lot of work done in Ontario, at Guelph and Ridgetown, on the effect of various crops on building soil organic matter. In this case here, the alfalfa, continuous alfalfa crop has built organic matter quite well, as you can see by the 4A, where the corn and soybeans on the other side are not near as good at building soil organic matter. This chart here talks about available water holding capacity, and the PWP, or permanent wilting point, is the bottom line. So below that is water that the plants can't reach, and above FC, or field capacity, that is excess water. If we got a heavy rain and you see water laying in the field, then that's above field capacity. If you get a good heavy rain and the soil is wet, but there's no water showing in the field, then you're somewhere in the middle of this graph. And that's the available water that is available for plants to use. So that's what we want. And you notice as the organic carbon goes up from, for example, 1% up to perhaps 8%, that water holding capacity really increases from less than 10% up to the 25% that we talked about earlier, of 25% of pore space holding water. So there's a lot of benefits to crop rotation and cover crops, and these are listed here, of improving the crop yields, improve the organic matter levels, and improving the resilience to weather extremes and to pests, and a whole lot of other factors as you go down through there. So I think the bottom line is, when we're looking at these, are that we want to produce healthy soils, to try to produce healthy crops, and those in turn can help produce or help feed healthy livestock and healthy people. Thank you for joining us talking about soil health.